Silas Ward was 3 seconds from putting a bullet in someone's skull when he saw her, his dead wife, standing on a street corner with a baby that had his eyes. The woman he'd buried 3 years ago after a yacht explosion was alive, desperate, and holding the son he never knew existed. Someone had faked her death, stolen 3 years of his child's life. And now Silas had exactly one question: who orchestrated the lie? Before we go right in, welcome to Empire Stories, where we bring you very exciting stories each day. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story promises to be more thrilling. Word had just reached him that someone in his inner circle had turned, a rat in his organization. And in his world, disloyalty was answered with only one currency: death. The traffic light ahead burned red, casting its crimson glow across the sharp planes of his face, illuminating the intricate black ink that crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. His eyes, cold and gray as winter steel, reflected nothing but the promise of violence. Then the world went silent. The honking horns, the distant sirens, the hum of the engine beneath him, all of it faded into a hollow void. Because on the corner ahead, beneath the harsh glare of a cracked streetlight, a woman stood selling small bunches of wildflowers from a cardboard box. Her clothes were faded and worn, her face gaunt and shadowed by exhaustion. Her hair fell in dark, tangled waves around shoulders that seemed too thin, too fragile. Silas recognized her instantly. She was not a stranger. She was Tessa Morgan, his ex-wife. The woman he had mourned for 3 endless years after a yacht explosion tore her from his life and left him a hollow shell of a man. The woman whose memory had turned him into something darker, something merciless. And now she stood there, alive, cradling a small child against her hip, a boy with sandy hair and eyes that froze Silas to his core, eyes identical to his own, eyes that stared out at the passing traffic with an unsettling, ancient awareness. Everything Silas had believed, everything he had buried and built walls around, shattered in an instant. The empire he had clawed together with blood and brutality, the reputation he had forged in fire and fear. It all meant nothing, not because of a rival syndicate, not because of federal heat or internal rebellion, but because the ghost of a love he thought was dead had just risen from the grave, and she was holding his son. The air inside the car grew suffocating. Silas stared through the windshield, his knuckles white against the armrest, his chest constricting, until every breath felt like shattered glass in his lungs. He had spent 3 years convincing himself she was gone. 3 years building a fortress around the wounds she left behind. 3 years becoming a man who felt nothing. But now, staring at her across the gridlocked intersection, he felt everything. Tessa didn't see him. She bent down, her movements slow and careful, adjusting the strap of the baby carrier across her chest. She whispered something to the child. Oliver, he would later learn his name was Oliver, and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Then she straightened, holding out a wilted bouquet to a passing businessman who waved her off without a glance. Her posture was different now, defeated, guarded. The fierce confidence she once carried like armor had been stripped away, leaving only survival instinct and bone-deep weariness. She had been running. That much was obvious. But from what? From whom? From him? Or from something far worse lurking in the shadows of the criminal underworld he ruled? Silas couldn't move. Every muscle in his body had locked into place, rigid and unresponsive. He wanted to throw the door open, stride across the street, grab her by the shoulders, and demand answers. Demand to know why she had let him believe she was dead. Demand to know whose child she held. Demand to know if the boy with his eyes was his son. But he remained frozen. Because what overwhelmed him first was not joy or relief. It was fear, a cold, primal terror that Silas Ward, a man who had killed without hesitation, who had built his throne on the bones of his enemies, had not allowed himself to feel in over a decade. Fear that if she was alive and had stayed away, the reason was something so terrible, so unforgivable, that knowing it would destroy him. His driver, a silent enforcer named Hayes, leaned slightly toward him and murmured, "Lights green, boss." But Silas didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't breathe. His gaze remained locked on the woman across the street, as if the slightest shift in his attention would make her vanish like smoke. Then, in a voice scraped raw with something darker than rage, something closer to anguish, he forced out a single word. Drive. The Escalade rolled forward, cutting through the stalled traffic and leaving the intersection behind. Leaving Tessa and his child, standing beneath the flickering streetlight with a box of dying flowers and a secret that could unravel everything. Silas sat rigid in the back seat, his hand still gripping the armrest with enough force to leave indentations in the leather. He wanted to scream at Hayes to turn around, to go back, to stop the car so he could run to her. But he didn't. Not because he lacked the will, but because, for the first time in 3 years, Silas Ward lacked the courage. For 3 years, he had existed as something less than alive, a walking corpse dressed in expensive suits and drenched in the blood of anyone who crossed him. His soul had been incinerated the day the yacht exploded off the coast. The day the Coast Guard recovered nothing but charred debris and a single scorched wedding band that he still kept locked in his desk drawer. He had knelt in the rain at her empty grave, alone and howling like a wounded animal, until his voice gave out and his knees sank into the mud. He had disappeared from the world for months, retreating into the dark corners of his empire. And when he re-emerged, he was no longer the man who had loved Tessa Morgan. He was something colder, harder, unrecognizable even to himself. A king without a heart, a ruler without mercy. But now, with a single glimpse through the suffocating heat and exhaust, everything he had accepted as truth began to crack. Tessa was alive, and she had a child. A boy who couldn't be older than 2 or 3. Silas closed his eyes, fighting the tidal wave of emotion rising in his chest, threatening to drown him. It was impossible. This was impossible. But the boy's eyes, those cold, gray, unmistakable eyes, told him everything he needed to know. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas Ward felt his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. The call came 20 minutes later, placed from a burner phone in the back office of a warehouse Silas owned on the waterfront. Hayes stood by the door, arms crossed, silent as a tomb. Silas pressed the phone to his ear and spoke in a voice stripped of all inflection. "Find her. I don't care how. I don't care what it won. Track her movements, where she sleeps, who she talks to, what she eats. I want eyes on her every second, but she doesn't know you're there. Understood?" On the other end, his lieutenant, a man named Garrett who had served Silas for over a decade, hesitated for only a heartbeat before responding. "Understood, boss. Should I bring her in?" "No." The word came out sharp, final. "Just watch. Report back to me. No one else." Silas ended the call and let the phone drop onto the desk with a hollow clatter. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring at nothing. The walls of the office pressed in around him, suffocating and cold, filled with the ghosts of decisions he couldn't undo. For 3 years, he had accepted her death without question. The explosion had been catastrophic, they said. The yacht incinerated in seconds. The debris scattered across miles of open water. The Coast Guard recovered fragments. A charred life jacket, twisted metal. Her wedding band fused to a piece of scorched railing. He had held that ring in his palm, felt its weight, and believed. But now, replaying every detail in his mind, the cracks appeared. The investigation had been rushed. The identification is inconclusive. No body, no dental records. Just assumptions and a convenient narrative that closed the case within weeks. Someone had wanted him to believe she was dead. Someone had orchestrated the entire charade with surgical precision, knowing he would be too broken, too consumed by grief, to dig deeper. And the boy, Oliver, that child with his eyes, his bone structure, the same stubborn set to his jaw. Silas had seen himself in that face, undeniable and absolute. The boy couldn't be older than 2, maybe 3, which meant Tessa had been pregnant when she disappeared. Pregnant with his son, and someone had stolen that from him. 3 years. 3 years of his son's life erased. First words, first steps, first laughter. All of it taken, buried beneath a lie so monstrous it made his blood run cold. Silas's hands curled into fists on the desk, his knuckles white, the ink on his fingers stretching taut over bone. The rage simmering beneath his skin was different now, not the explosive, immediate fury he felt in traffic. This was something deeper, colder, a quiet, patient wrath that would burn everything in its path until he found the truth. What would you do if someone stole 3 years of your child's life from you? Silas didn't believe in mercy anymore, but he believed in answers, and he would tear apart every lie, every shadow, every carefully constructed deception until he found the person responsible. If you believe no one has the right to steal a father's chance to know his child, hit subscribe, because this wasn't just about Tessa anymore. This was about the years he would never get back, the torment of stolen time, and someone, somewhere was going to pay for every single second. Garrett returned 4 days later with a manila envelope thick with surveillance photographs. He slid it across Silas's desk without a word, his expression unreadable. Silas tore it open, spreading the images across the polished surface like a deck of cards revealing a losing hand. Tessa at a bus stop, Oliver asleep against her shoulder. Tessa in a cramped convenience store, counting coins from her pocket. Tessa standing outside a rundown apartment building, keys in hand, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. She looked haunted, hollowed out, a woman who had learned to live in fear. Silas studied each photograph with the focus of a man reading his own autopsy report. Every detail mattered: the cheap clothes, the exhaustion carved into her face, the way she held Oliver close, always close, as if the world itself might snatch him away. "She's clean," Garrett said quietly. "No contacts, no calls, no visitors. She works 2 jobs, waitressing at a diner on 5th and cleaning offices at night. She's surviving, barely." Silas didn't respond. His gaze had locked onto one photograph in particular. Tessa crouched beside Oliver in a park, tying his shoe, her hand gentle on his ankle. The boy was smiling, laughing at something she'd said. A moment of stolen joy in a life built on ruins. Silas's jaw tightened. He shoved the photos aside and stood abruptly, crossing to the far wall where a steel safe was embedded in the concrete. He spun the dial with practiced precision, pulled the heavy door open, and reached inside. The ledger was old, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. It had belonged to his foster father, a man who had taught Silas the brutal mechanics of the underworld before dying under mysterious circumstances 5 years ago. Silas had kept it locked away, a relic he'd never fully understood until now. He carried it back to the desk and began flipping through the coded entries, his eyes scanning the shorthand notations and cryptic abbreviations, dates, names, transactions. And then, buried deep in the final pages, he found it. A notation dated 3 years and 2 months ago, the same week Tessa disappeared. Operation Severance, remove the weakness. Ensure clean break. DW authorized. No trace. DW? Dante Ward, Silas's uncle, his mentor, the man who had raised him after his foster father's death, who had molded him into the ruthless kingpin he had become, the man he had trusted above all others. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Silas read the entry again, then again, his mind rejecting what his eyes confirmed. Dante had orchestrated the explosion. Dante had stolen Tessa from him. Dante had erased his son from existence. Could you ever forgive someone who destroyed your family to control you? Silas's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the ledger, the leather creaking under the pressure. Everything he had believed, every foundation he had built his life upon, was a lie constructed by the one man he had never thought to question. Garrett watched him carefully, sensing the shift. "Boss?" Silas looked up, his eyes cold and empty, stripped of everything but a singular, terrible clarity. "Find Dante," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know where he is, who he's with, and what he's planning." And Garrett, he paused, his gaze hardening into something inhuman. "This stays between us. If Dante finds out I know, Tessa and Oliver are dead. Comment family over betrayal if you believe no one should manipulate the people they claim to love." Because Silas Ward had just discovered that the enemy wasn't outside his empire. The enemy had been sitting at his table all along. Silas waited until midnight when the warehouse district fell silent and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway. Garrett arrived alone, as instructed, his footsteps echoing across the empty loading dock. He stopped 10 feet from where Silas stood beneath a single flickering bulb, his face half swallowed by shadow. "You knew," Silas said, not a question, a statement carved from stone. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had been with Silas long enough to know when denial was useless. "Yes." The word hung in the air like a confession at a funeral. Silas took a step forward, his hand resting on the grip of the gun tucked into his waistband. "How long?" "From the beginning." Garrett's voice was steady, controlled, but something flickered behind his eyes. Regret, maybe even fear. "Dante came to me 3 years ago. He said Tessa was a liability, that you were getting soft, distracted. He said an heir would make you weak, vulnerable to rivals. He ordered me to eliminate her." Silas's hand tightened around the gun, his knuckles white. "And you agreed?" "No," Garrett's voice sharpened. "I told him I'd handle it. But I didn't, commander Silas. I couldn't. You loved her. She was carrying your child. So I staged the explosion, made it look real, bought her a new identity, kitchen a way out. I told her to run and never look back." The silence that followed was suffocating. Silas stared at Garrett, his mind racing through the implications, the layers of deception and twisted loyalty. "You let me grieve for 3 years. You watched me destroy myself, and you said nothing. Because if Dante knew she was alive, he would have sent someone else. Someone who wouldn't hesitate." Garrett's voice cracked just slightly. "I saved her, Silas. I saved your son, but I had to let you believe she was dead, or Dante would have known something was wrong." Silas pulled the gun, leveling it at Garrett's chest. His hand didn't shake, his breath didn't hitch, but his eyes burned with the kind of pain that could collapse a man from the inside out. "You stole 3 years from me. You let me bury an empty casket. You let me become this." He gestured to himself, to the hollow, ruthless thing he had transformed into. "You think that's loyalty? I think it's the only reason they're still alive." Garrett didn't move, didn't beg. He met Silas's gaze with the calm of a man who had already accepted his fate. "You can kill me, I won't stop you. But if you do, you'll lose the only person who knows every move Dante's made, every contact he has, every safe house he uses. I've been tracking him for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to tell you. Who's more dangerous, the enemy who stabs you in the front or the one who claims to protect you while twisting the knife?" Silas lowered the gun slowly, his chest heaving with restrained fury. He wanted to pull the trigger, wanted to punish Garrett for the years of lies, the unbearable weight of grief he had carried alone. But beneath the rage was something more complicated. Garrett had betrayed him, but Garrett had also saved Tessa and Oliver when no one else would have. "You work for me now," Silas said, his voice cold and final. "Not Dante, not anyone else. And if you lie to me again, I won't hesitate." Garrett nodded once. "Understood. If you believe loyalty means telling the truth even when it's painful, like this, if you'd never manipulate someone you claim to serve." Because Silas had just learned the cruelest lesson of all. Sometimes betrayal wore the mask of protection, and trust, once shattered, could never be fully repaired. The call came at 2 in the morning. Garrett's voice was sharp, urgent. "They found her. Dante sent someone. You need to move now." Silas was already reaching for his keys before the line went dead. He drove through the empty streets like a man possessed, the speedometer climbing past 90, past 100, the city blurring into streaks of light and shadow. His phone buzzed with the address, a decrepit apartment building on the east side, the kind of place where people disappeared and nobody asked questions. He arrived to the sound of breaking glass. Silas took the stairs 3 at a time, his gun already drawn, his pulse hammering in his ears. The door to Tessa's apartment hung open, splintered at the hinges. Inside, chaos, overturned furniture, shattered dishes, and in the corner, pressed against the wall with Oliver clutched to her chest, Tessa stared up at the man looming over her. The assassin was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a black mask. He held a knife, the blade catching the dim light as he moved closer. Dante sends his regards, he said, his voice flat and mechanical. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot echoing through the cramped space like thunder. The assassin crumpled, the knife clattering to the floor, a pool of blood spreading slowly beneath him. Tessa flinched at the sound, her arms tightening around Oliver, who had started to cry, a sharp, terrified wail that cut through Silas like a blade. She looked up, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. And when she saw him standing in the doorway, something broke inside her. "Silas!" she whispered, her voice cracking. He crossed the room in 3 strides, holstering his gun, and dropped to his knees in front of her. Up close, she looked even more fragile than the photographs had shown. Her cheekbones were too sharp, her hands trembling, her eyes ringed with exhaustion and fear. But she was alive. She was here, and so was his son. Oliver had stopped crying, his small face buried against Tessa's shoulder, his tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her shirt. Silas reached out slowly, carefully, as if the child might shatter at his touch. "Can I?" His voice broke. He swallowed hard and tried again. "Can I hold him?" Tessa hesitated, her gaze searching his face for something. Reassurance, maybe? Or forgiveness? Then slowly she nodded. Silas lifted Oliver from her arms, and the world stopped. The boy was heavier than he expected, warm and solid and real. His hair was soft, tousled from sleep, and his eyes, those unmistakable gray eyes, stared up at Silas with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Oliver's small hand reached out, touched the ink on Silas's neck, and traced the lines with the kind of innocent wonder that only children possessed. Silas's throat tightened, his vision blurred. He held his son closer, pressing his lips to the top of Oliver's head. And for the first time in 3 years, something inside him cracked open. This was his child, his blood, his future, and someone had tried to erase him from existence. The rage that flooded through Silas in that moment was unlike anything he had ever felt. Not the explosive fury of betrayal, not the cold calculation of revenge. This was something primal, absolute. A force of nature that would burn the world to ash if it meant keeping this child safe. "No one will ever touch you again," Silas whispered into Oliver's hair, his voice raw and broken. "I swear it." Like this, if you believe a parent's first duty is to protect their child. People like Dante who target innocent families deserve nothing but justice. Because Silas Ward had just been reborn. Not as a kingpin, not as a killer, but as a father willing to wage war against anyone who threatened his son. The bunker was buried 3 stories beneath an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, a fortress Silas had constructed years ago for exactly this kind of contingency. Steel-reinforced walls, multiple exits, surveillance covering every angle. Tessa and Oliver would be safe here, protected by 6 of his most loyal men, while Silas prepared to do what he should have done the moment he discovered the truth. He stood in the dim light of the bunker's main room, watching Tessa settle Oliver onto a makeshift bed, her movements gentle but mechanical, like a woman who had forgotten what safety felt like. She hadn't spoken much since the attack, hadn't asked him where he'd been or why he'd come back. She just held onto Oliver and survived, the way she had been surviving for 3 years. Silas turned away, his jaw tight, and climbed the stairs back to ground level, where Garrett waited beside a black SUV. "Dante's still breathing," Silas said, his voice flat and lethal. "That ends tonight." Garrett nodded. "He's been orchestrating this from the beginning. The explosion, the assassin, all of it. He knew you'd eventually find out, so he's been consolidating power, preparing for the moment you came for him. Then let's give him what he's expecting." Silas pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts, names he hadn't spoken to in years. Men who had once stood beside him before Dante had systematically dismantled their lives, framing them for crimes they didn't commit, forcing them into exile or prison. Men who had every reason to want Dante dead. The first call connected after 2 rings. "Silas Ward," a gravelly voice answered, laced with suspicion. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Rourke," Silas said. "Dante set you up 5 years ago, sent you to prison for a deal he orchestrated. You want payback?" A long pause. Then, "I'm listening. Meet me at the warehouse on 9th, 1 hour, come armed." He made 2 more calls. To Jonah Cross, a former enforcer, Dante had been framed for embezzlement and blacklisted from every organization in the city. To Nia Reyes, a strategist Dante had discarded when she questioned his methods, leaving her reputation in ruins. Each conversation was brief. Each answer was the same. They would come. An hour later, the 4 of them stood in the dim light of the warehouse, a collection of ghosts Dante had tried to erase. Rourke was broad and scarred, his eyes hard as granite. Jonah was leaner, quieter, but his hands never stopped moving, a nervous energy coiled tight. Nia stood with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and calculating, already mapping out strategies before Silas even spoke. Dante Ward destroyed all of us, Silas began, his voice cutting through the silence. He framed you, Rourke. He ruined you, Jonah. He tried to erase you, Nia, and he stole 3 years of my son's life by faking my wife's death. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Now we take everything from him. His empire, his reputation, his life. Nia stepped forward, her expression grim. This isn't just a hit. This is war. Good, Silas said, his eyes cold and unflinching. Because I'm not interested in mercy. I'm interested in annihilation. Rourke cracked his knuckles, a savage grin spreading across his face. When do we start? Now, in turn. Comment justice for the broken if you stand against people who destroy lives just to hold on to power. Because Silas Ward had just declared war on the man who had made him. And he wouldn't stop until Dante's empire was nothing but ash and memory. The warehouse sat on the edge of the industrial district, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and broken windows that hadn't seen legitimate business in over a decade. Dante had purchased it years ago under a shell company, a place so forgotten even the city had stopped sending inspectors. It was the perfect place to hide secrets. Silas and his team arrived just after midnight, moving through the shadows like predators stalking prey. Rourke took point, his bulk moving with surprising silence, while Nia covered the rear, her eyes scanning every angle for traps or surveillance. Jonah worked on the side entrance, his fingers moving quickly over the rusted padlock until it clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Moonlight filtered through the fractured roof, casting pale beams across stacks of abandoned crates and machinery left to rot. But Silas's attention fixed on the back corner, where a newer steel door stood out against the decrepit surroundings, its lock system far too advanced for a forgotten building. There, he said quietly. Jonah moved to the door, pulling a small device from his jacket. Within minutes, the lock disengaged with a soft hiss. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. They moved down in silence, weapons drawn, until they reached a basement office that looked untouched by time. A desk, filing cabinets, and most importantly, a safe embedded in the concrete wall. Rourke cracked it open with practiced efficiency, and inside they found what Dante had been so desperate to hide. 3 external hard drives labeled with dates spanning the last 5 years, and a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes in Dante's precise script. Silas grabbed the journal first, flipping through pages of coded entries and strategic plans. His eyes caught on a section dated 6 months ago, and the words made his blood run cold. Phase 3, elimination. Target, Silas Ward. Method, staged accident, preferably vehicular. Timeline, within the year. Justification, nephew has outlived usefulness. Organization restructure to follow. New leadership, self. The room fell silent as Silas read the passage aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. Dante hadn't just wanted to control him. Dante had been planning to kill him all along, to eliminate Silas the moment he'd consolidated enough power to take over the syndicate completely. Nia took the hard drives, connecting one to her laptop. Files began populating the screen: financial records, hit orders, surveillance footage, communications with corrupt officials. A complete map of Dante's empire, including safe houses, offshore accounts, and a network of loyalists embedded throughout the city. This is everything, Nia said, her voice tight with controlled intensity. Every transaction, every deal, every person on his payroll. We can dismantle his entire operation with this. Silas stared at the screen, watching years of manipulation and calculated cruelty scroll past in lines of data. Dante had been meticulous, documenting every move, every betrayal, every life destroyed in his quest for absolute power, including the order to eliminate Tessa and Oliver. He kept records of everything, Jonah muttered. Arrogant bastard thought he was untouchable. He was wrong, Silas said, closing the journal with a snap. He looked at his team, his expression carved from stone. We have his playbook. We know his safe houses, his contacts, his next moves. Now we use it to corner him. Rourke grinned, savage and anticipatory. Where do we find him? Naya pulled up a file, a location marked in red on a digital map. Underground facility, 40 miles outside the city. Heavy security, but if we hit it fast and hard. We will, Silas interrupted. His eyes burned with cold certainty. Gather everything. We move at dawn. Because Silas Ward now held every secret Dante had tried to bury, and he would use them to drag his uncle into the light and end him. Naya worked through the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she decrypted layer after layer of Dante's encrypted files. The team gathered around her laptop in the bunker's operations room, the glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across their faces. Coffee cups littered the table, untouched and cold, as they watched data emerge from the digital darkness. Most of this is standard, Nia muttered, scrolling through financial transactions and communication logs. Shell companies, offshore accounts, payroll for dozens of operatives. But there's something here that doesn't fit. She paused, her eyes narrowing. There's a recurring payment, substantial. Monthly deposits to an account with no name, no identification, no record in any of Dante's other files. Silas leaned closer. How much? $500,000 every month for the last 8 years. Naya pulled up a timeline tracing the payments back to their origin. The first deposit was made 3 months before your foster father died. The most recent was 2 weeks ago. The room fell silent. Rourke exchanged a glance with Jonah, both men's expressions darkening. Someone that valuable, that invisible, Silas said slowly, doesn't exist by accident. Dante's been keeping him off the books for a reason. Naya dug deeper, cross-referencing the payment dates with Dante's journal entries. A pattern emerged. Every major operation, every calculated elimination, every stage accident. There was a corresponding payment to the ghost account within days. Then she found it. A single notation in Dante's journal from 3 years ago, written in shorthand. Watcher deployed, yacht op, clean severance confirmed. The Watcher, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's the one who staged the explosion. Naya nodded grimly. And if Dante's kept him this hidden, he's not just an enforcer. He's Dante's insurance policy, the man who handles the jobs Dante can never be connected to. Jonah leaned forward. So we find him. We find Dante. Nia's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, tracking the ghost account's activity. The payments are routed through 3 different offshore banks, but they all terminate at a single location for withdrawal. She pulled up a map, zooming in on a remote area 40 miles outside the city. Here, an underground facility listed as a private storage company, but the power consumption is off the charts, enough to run a small military base. Silas stared at the map, his jaw tight. This was it, Dante's fortress. The place where he'd been orchestrating everything, pulling strings from the shadows while Silas grieved, enraged, and rebuilt himself into something monstrous. And the Watcher was there, the ghost who had stolen 3 years of his son's life, who had condemned Tessa to a life of fear and running, who had lit the fuse on the lie that had consumed Silas whole. Would you let someone who destroyed your family walk free, or would you hunt them to the ends of the earth? Rourke cracked his knuckles, his expression savage. When do we move? Silas didn't hesitate. Tonight, we go in hard, we go in fast, and we don't leave until Dante and his ghost are dead. Nia began pulling up schematics, analyzing entry points and security protocols. This isn't going to be easy. The facility's designed to withstand a siege. Good, Silas said, his voice cold and final, because I'm not here to lay siege. I'm here to burn it to the ground. Because Silas Ward had finally found the man who had orchestrated his greatest loss. And nothing, not walls, not security, not an army, would stop him from ending this. The assault began at 3 in the morning, when the world was at its darkest and most vulnerable. Rourke and Jonah took the front entrance, drawing fire and security forces away from the primary target. Naya coordinated from a surveillance van 2 miles out, feeding real-time intel through encrypted comms. And Silas, with Garrett at his side, moved through the underground tunnels like a shadow with a blade. They encountered resistance, guards loyal to Dante, mercenaries paid to protect the fortress. But Silas moved through them with cold efficiency, every shot precise, every movement calculated. This wasn't rage, this was execution. The tunnel opened into a steel corridor lined with reinforced doors. At the end, a larger door stood ajar, warm light spilling through the gap. Silas approached slowly, his gun raised, his heartbeat steady and controlled. Inside, Dante Ward sat behind a mahogany desk, his hands folded calmly as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. He was older now, his hair silver, his face lined with age, but his eyes still burned with the same ruthless intelligence that had built an empire. "Silas," Dante said, his voice smooth and measured. "I wondered when you'd finally come." Silas stepped inside, Garrett covering the door behind him. "You killed her. You stole my son from me. You destroyed 3 years of our lives." Dante smiled, a thin, joyless expression. "I saved you. You were weak, Silas. Soft. Love made you vulnerable, distracted. You were becoming a liability to everything we'd built." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "So I cut the heart out of you. I removed the weakness. And look what you became, the most feared man in this city. Ruthless, unstoppable. You should be thanking me." Silas's hand tightened around his gun, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You think stealing my family made me strong? I think it made you what you needed to be." Dante stood slowly, his hand still visible, non-threatening. "Power requires sacrifice, Silas. I taught you that. Your father taught you that. And one day you'll teach your son the same lesson." The words landed like a physical blow. Silas saw it then, the twisted logic, the generational curse that had poisoned every man in his bloodline. The belief that love was weakness, that family was a vulnerability to be eliminated, that power could only be held by those willing to destroy everything they cared about. "No," Silas said quietly, "I'm not you, and I'm not my father. I'm breaking this." Dante's expression shifted, something like disappointment flickering across his face. "Then you've already lost." Silas raised his gun, his hand steady, his voice cold and final. "No, I've already won." The shot echoed through the fortress, a single deafening crack that ended decades of tyranny and manipulation. Dante crumpled backward, his eyes wide with shock, blood spreading across his pristine white shirt. He tried to speak, tried to say something final, but only a wet, choking sound emerged. Silas watched him die, felt nothing but a hollow, distant satisfaction. No triumph, no relief, just the quiet certainty that the curse had finally ended. Garrett stepped forward, checking the body. "He's gone." Silas holstered his gun, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "Good, burn everything, the files, the records, the entire operation. I want nothing left of him." If you believe some people forfeit their right to mercy when they destroy innocent lives like this, Dante got exactly what he deserved. Because Silas Ward had just killed the man who made him. And in doing so, he had finally become free. The retaliation came 48 hours later, swift and desperate. Dante's remaining loyalists, leaderless and panicked, made one final attempt to salvage what was left of the empire. They hit the bunker at dawn, a dozen armed men converging on the location with military precision. But Silas had anticipated this. Rourke and his team were waiting, fortified and ready. The assault lasted less than 10 minutes. When the gunfire finally stopped, Dante's men lay scattered across the gravel, and the bunker remained untouched. Inside, Tessa held Oliver close, whispering soft reassurances as the sound of distant sirens faded into silence. She looked up when Silas entered, her eyes searching his face for something. Confirmation, maybe, or closure. "It's over," he said quietly. "Dante's dead, His people are scattered or eliminated. No one's coming for you anymore. Tessa exhaled, a shuddering breath she'd been holding for 3 years. What happens now? Silas crouched down beside her, his gaze shifting to Oliver, who sat playing with a toy car, oblivious to the violence that had just unfolded outside. Now we leave. All of us. Over the next week, Silas systematically dismantled everything Dante had built. Shell companies dissolved. Offshore accounts emptied and distributed to the families of those Dante had destroyed. Safe houses burned. Loyalists hunted down and given a single choice: disappear or die. Most chose wisely. Nia took over the logistics, ensuring no trace of Dante's network remained operational. Rourke and Jonah handled the remaining enforcers, cutting off every head of the Hydra until nothing was left but ash and memory. And Garrett, ever loyal, made sure every record, every file, every piece of evidence that could tie Silas to the violence was erased. By the end of it, the empire Dante had spent decades building was gone, reduced to smoke and forgotten names. On a cool morning in late September, Silas loaded a single black duffel bag into the trunk of an unmarked sedan. No armor, no entourage, no throne, just the three of them, Silas, Tessa, and Oliver, and a road that led away from the city, away from the blood-soaked legacy that had defined his entire life. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting on Oliver's head as the boy dozed in his car seat. She looked over at Silas, her expression cautious but softening. "Where are we going?" Silas started the engine, his hand steady on the wheel. "Somewhere no one knows our names. Somewhere Oliver can grow up without looking over his shoulder." He paused, glancing at her. "Somewhere we can start over." Tessa's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "Do you think we can?" Silas looked in the rearview mirror at his son, sleeping peacefully, unburdened by the weight of the past. "I think we have to try." The car pulled away from the bunker, leaving behind the wreckage of the Ward Syndicate, the fortress, the empire built on brutality and fear. Silas drove through the city limits, past the neighborhoods where he'd once ruled with absolute power, past the crossroads where he'd first seen Tessa holding their son, past the life he'd known and the man he used to be. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the highway. Silas rolled down the window, letting the cool air fill the car, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he'd forgotten existed: hope. If you believe family is worth more than any empire, comment freedom over power, because Silas just chose the hardest, bravest path. Because Silas Ward was no longer a kingpin. He was a father. A husband trying to rebuild what had been stolen, and as the city disappeared in the rearview mirror, he knew he'd made the only choice that mattered. The throne was gone, but his family was alive, and that was enough.